From Oleksander Usyk outclassing Michael Hunter to dominating Anthony Joshua in their first bout, these are the best fights of Usyk's career. Let's begin with his imposing victory over Hunter. While the American is a heavyweight contender, there was once a time when he was one of the hottest prospects in the cruiserweight division. Before his bout with the Ukrainian, he'd won all 12 of his fights. But then, the Cat showed him who's boss. Both men met on April 8, 2017. And while Michael put up a relatively good fight, the Ukrainian made him look like a chump. Usyk used the first 4 rounds to feel out his opponent and dominated Hunter from rounds 5 through 12. Plus, Oleksander threw over 250 punches in the last 3 rounds alone. And a whole lot of those connected. Talk about having insane cardio. Thanks to his phenomenal showing, the Ukrainian was able to successfully defend his WBO Cruiserweight Championship for the second time. But his performance against Krzysztof Glowacki to win the title was even better. Oleksander looked like $1 million in this fight. After winning his first 9 fights as a pro boxer, Usyk proved to everyone that he was ready for primetime when he faced off against Krzysztof in September 2016. And the fact that he was able to do that with the odds stacked against him was even more impressive. Not only was Oleksander up against a man who had won all 26 of his fights, he had to fly out to the champ's homeland for the fight. Though Usyk couldn't have cared less as he remained unfazed and put on a masterclass. As expected, Glowacki fought with all his heart. However, Oleksander was the better man in every way, especially towards the end. The Cat's speed, power, skill, and stamina were on another level, allowing him to win the coveted WBO Cruiserweight Championship. Then, he destroyed Thabiso Mchunu in his first title defense. Both men met on the 17th of December 2016, just 3 months after Usyk won the championship. It was the first time Oleksander was fighting in the US, and boy, did he put on a show. While Mchunu gave Usyk a tough time because of how technical he is, once the Ukrainian figured him out, it was pure domination. It's not like the South African was bad, it was just that whatever he could do, Oleksander could do it better. And before Thabiso knew it, he was knocked down twice in the 9th round. But that's not surprising, given that the Ukrainian had unleashed a barrage of punches on his opponent. Ultimately, the Cat proved to be way too much for the South African, and he won the bout via TKO. Though, as great as Oleksander was against Thabiso, he somehow managed to look even better in his heavyweight debut. In fact, he straight up annihilated Chaz Witherspoon. After destroying everyone who stood in his path in the cruiserweight division, Usyk moved up to heavyweight and faced Chaz in October 2019. All eyes were on the Cat, as some were unsure about how he'd fare against a heavyweight. But he went out there and silenced his doubters. He looked just as dominant as he did at cruiserweight, if not more. After all, he beat Witherspoon so badly that he had to tell the referee he couldn't go any longer. The Ukrainian was awarded a 7th round victory via a referee technical decision. And, of course, this wasn't the only time he annihilated his opponent, because he obliterated Tony Bellew. The Cat went up against Bellew in November 2018, just 11 months before he beat Chaz. Oleksander was defending his WBA Super, WBC, IBF, WBO, and the Ring Cruiserweight titles, and retaining them against Tony was all he needed to cement himself as one of the greatest cruiserweights of all time. Luckily for him, he did just that. As was expected, Tony was putting up a fight, but Usyk dismantled him in the 8th round with a flurry of punches. Ultimately, the Ukrainian showed the boxing world that he was above and beyond the rest of the division as he won via KO. It really was a performance for the ages. Speaking of performances for the ages, I can't forget about his fight against Marco Huck. The fighters met in September 2017, and it was the World Boxing Super Series Cruiserweight Quarter-Final. The Cat's WBO Cruiserweight title was on the line. And of course, he also needed the win to advance to the next round. Even though the stakes were high, Usyk wasn't even a little fazed. Huck tried his best, but it was clear that the Ukrainian was the better fighter. Ultimately, he demolished Marco in the 11th round, securing the W via TKO. While most of the fights I've told you about were easy money for Oleksander, there have been some fights where he's had to dig deep in order to secure the W, and that includes his bout against Derek Chisora. After making light work of Chaz, the Cat fought Chisora in October 2020, in what many claimed was his first real test at heavyweight. This fight would determine whether Oleksander could truly hang with the big boys of the heavyweight division, so losing just wasn't an option for the Ukrainian. The matchup was nothing short of a slobber knocker as both men went out there and did their level best to come out on top. But in the end, it was Usyk who emerged victorious. He earned a unanimous decision victory after a hard-fought 12 rounds. But there's no doubt that Chisora was one of Usyk's toughest battles to date. But most importantly, Usyk learned a lot coming out of this matchup and showed the boxing world that he was a true heavyweight contender. So, this was one of the biggest wins of his career. If he didn't win this bout, he wouldn't be where he currently is. The outcome of this fight is what earned him a shot at AJ's belts. But hey, at least it was still a unanimous decision. So, Usyk was the better man, according to all judges, though this wasn't the case when he matched up against Maurice Breedes. After finishing Huck, the Cat faced against the Latvian in the World Boxing Super Series Cruiserweight semifinal back in January 2018. As has been the case with Usyk in the past, the odds were stacked against him. He was up against an experienced and then undefeated fighter, and even had to fly out to Latvia for the fight. The stakes were insanely high as it was the semi-final of the tournament, and both men had their titles on the line. Oleksander and Maurice treated fans to an enthralling 12 rounds, but most importantly, the Latvian came closer to beating the Ukrainian than anyone ever has. The fight was one of the best of the year, as both boxers went at each other round after round. But in the end, it was one man who came out victorious. And of course, it was the Cat. But don't be fooled, it wasn't a unanimous decision. Rather, it was a majority decision. This was the closest fight Oleksander ever had, as Maurice narrowly fell short on the scorecards. And then, Usyk made it to the finals of the World Boxing Super Series in what was one of the biggest fights of his career. I'm talking about his phenomenal showing against Murat Gassiev. As usual, the Cat went to his opponent's home country for the fight. But this time, it was different because he was up against a Russian. And just 4 years before the fight, Russia had invaded and taken over the Crimea Peninsula from Ukraine. So, Oleksander flew to enemy territory in June 2018 with the hope of making his country proud. Much like many others the Ukrainian faced, Murat was unbeaten before their bout. Plus, Gassiev's WBA and IBF cruiserweight titles were on the line, and so were Usyk's WBO and WBC cruiserweight titles, while the vacant Ring cruiserweight title was up for grabs too. Even though the Ukrainian was under a lot of pressure, he went out there and outclassed the Russian in a fantastic fight that went the distance. Usyk was awarded the win via unanimous decision, allowing him to hold 5 cruiserweight titles. But none of these fights compare to Oleksander's performance against one of the greatest heavyweights of the modern era. He made Anthony Joshua look like an amateur when they first met. After taking out Chaz and Chisora, the Cat earned himself a shot at AJ's coveted WBA, IBF, WBO, and WBO heavyweight titles. Many doubted whether Oleksander could get the job done. But on the 25th of September 2021, he silenced every single one of his doubters. He put on an absolute masterclass against a man who was bigger and heavier than him. Yet, as is usual with Usyk, he didn't let the bright lights get to him as he dominated the Brit in what was the greatest technical performance of his career. So, from dominating Anthony Joshua in their first bout to outclassing Michael Hunter, those were the best fights of Usyk's career.